Hey everybody, welcome to our summer midweek experience. We're so thrilled you decided to join us. And if you're just popping in on us, we're in the middle of a summer series called What the World Needs Now. The idea behind the series is it seems like our world is struggling to cope with the challenges of life and certainly the current cultural climate of our world. And we believe that Jesus has come to help us to experience what we all need most. And not only that, but to provide through his church what the world needs most in this season. And so we've been experiencing some of that content on the weekend, and some of it's going to be through these midweek gatherings, but it's all around the fruit of his Spirit. That this fruit of his Spirit are the things that the world needs most right now. And we've invited some outside voices and some experts on our weekend. And then during these midweek experiences, Steve Carter, our teaching pastor, and I are going to be joined by two of our pastor friends. Ben Snyder, he's the lead pastor of a church in Ohio, and Bree Johns, who served for over 12 years at Central Christian Church right here in Arizona. We're going to be having conversations around the fruit of the Spirit that we hope you find helpful and insightful for you and for the people around you. Now, as you're engaging with us, if you're live, join us in the chat, either on Facebook or on YouTube. We'd love to engage with you there in these conversations. But if you find these conversations helpful, please share them with your friends. And stick around to the very end, by the way, because our team has created some worship videos for you to experience at the end that are going to be worth sticking around for. So thanks so much for joining us. We look forward to engaging with you in this midweek experience.
I think one of the things that our world needs now is joy. So it's kind of an elusive thing, but what's the first thing that comes to your mind when you hear the word joy?
I think of my kids and just like when they see something that really, like a candy shop or they're at their sports games, like they're lighting up joy. It's just so pure. So that's what I think of first.
Yeah, candy and kids equals joy. Sounds like I have different emotions when it comes to that. You know?
Me too, especially with my boys. I think of my daughter.
Okay.
Her middle name is Joy, Gentry Joy, and we named her after my sister. All my kids, their middle names come from family members, and we named her after my sister, who really resembles, like if you've ever met my sister, she's so much fun. She's a yellow. She's a blast. So but we only have one girl, and her middle name is Joy, and I know you've just met her, and it literally, she resembles it as well. Yeah. And I don't know how that works, but we decided before we even knew her, that was going to be her middle name, and she has really lived into it. She is a tremendous joy in our family.
Yeah, that's great. Steve?
I mean, it doesn't happen very often, but when my team wins, there's a lot of joy in my house.
I'm so glad you said that.
Who's your team again?
Because your team doesn't win very often.
Okay, I know we need it out on the table so that we know how much sorrow and grief you've really been feeling. I think this conversation is relevant to you.
Yeah. My world needs joy.
Yeah, your world. Yeah, Michigan needs some joy. Although the last time Notre Dame played Michigan, I was at that game.
I was too.
And it was tears of rain for me, and lots of rain. It was terrible. So, in light of that, for me, when I mow the grass, and the lines are just right.
There you go.
I totally do
My
the
husband does that.
dad thing, just arms folded, and I'm like, that's good.
That's good.
That's good right there, So that's funny. I think one of the things I realized as I was entering into just thinking about this fruit of the Spirit, or even the idea of joy, is just how difficult it is to define. I think we all have like a general sense, in the dictionary, it's a feeling of pleasure or happiness. But I think we realize that there probably needs to be something more to joy than just, wow, that was a lot of fun, in order for it to have some of the, probably the spiritual power or potency that we hope for. And so as I was thinking about this, a couple of the authors were like, hey, we don't always know how to define it, but we know it when we see it. What's it look like when you see joy? Like if we don't know what it is, I mean, you described your kids at the candy shop. What is it that what are some of the things that you see when you see joy at work?
I think it's a freedom, like where you feel lost in a moment that it like the moment just overwhelms you. Some experience that like just brings out a sheer delight that can't be just named, and it can't be bottled up. It just like has to come out of you.
Yeah.
You know?
I think in sports, which I know is one of your favorite subjects, you have at the same time the joy of the championship and the grief of a loss, all in the same.
Yeah.
The contrast there is fascinating. And if it's your team that won, you're entering into that joy. Yeah. If your team lost, you're obviously, experiencing the other side. What else? What else does it look like? Like for me, when I have a good meal, that first bite where you close, it's like, and you give like my kids call it like a moo cow, like, that's right.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So.
Mine's like at a buffet. Like I want to see all the options. I want to taste everything there. I never fill my plate with like one thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The joy of like the experience of the menu that is unending.
Yeah.
That brings me joy.
Yeah.
Options.
All the options.
Yeah.
All the tastes.
That's funny because one of the books that I looked at, Ingrid Fattel-Lee wrote the book called Joyful. She's a designer, and she begins the book by saying, most philosophers say that joy is within, but her argument is don't underestimate the external things that bring you joy.
Yeah.
And a buffet
Yeah.
or seeing something in abundance provokes a response, She talks about like when somebody experiences a painting. I know your wife paints. And so when she delivers a painting to someone, I don't know if she gets to see their first response, if it gets shipped to them, but what's that experience like for her?
I mean, she's done a number of shows, and so I mean, she'll talk about the moment where somebody will be walking and they'll stop and spend, just a few more minutes around a painting and just kind of like taking it in. And I think for her, it's like the appreciation or the thoughtfulness, or somehow there was a resonance or connection that speaks so much to her, and she loves watching it, and she'll see people go, oh yeah, and then move to the next, but then she'll see others that like it hits on something,
Yeah, I think for me, I've always kept joy in the internal space, and it was helpful to just kind of click back and think about kind of the journey that we go on, even externally. One of the things that she brings up in her book is about color and the role that color plays. We've talked a little bit about this. What's your favorite color?
Black.
Yeah,
Red.
That's interesting. Black.
Not a color.
It's red. It's a shade. That's
It's
what
not
my
a
wife always
color.
says. It's a shade.
It's not actually a color.
Yeah, it's an absorption of all of the other colors.
right,
So there could be something more
Blue.
to that.
Narcissist.
The darkness of your soul.
For me, my favorite color is blue and green. I like both of them. Has it always been that way? Has that always been your favorite color?
I
No.
love red now, but it used to be baby blue, and I think just it's like a color that makes you happy. Like
Okay.
everybody looks good in it.
Okay.
No.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've always loved blue, like the darker, warmer colors.
Okay.
So.
My favorite color used to be green. I don't know why, but it used to be green and now it's blue.
So when you think back to your childhood, think about baby blue or green or whatever blue. Did you have something, a piece of clothing? Did you paint a wall?
Yes.
A room? What did you do?
I painted my whole room baby blue.
Is that why you don't like it anymore?
I don't know, maybe I got tired of it. I don't know. But I still love it. I love that color still.
Yeah. Anything different for you?
I couldn't paint my walls as a kid, but
It could be, could be.
But
It sounds kind of black.
I know, yeah, totally. But I would say like so much of like I had blue flags, like like Michigan flags or certain colors, like
so it was
that
your
represented team or just joy, for me, so yeah.
My son just turned 12 on Monday, and his favorite color is orange.
Oh, nice.
And he will put himself in a completely orange outfit.
It's a good color.
It is well, I see what's going on here, okay? I see
It's a
what's
really
going on
good
here.
color.
The sports jab, that's great. And I look at that and I go, I could never wear that. I could never, I mean, I got him a pair of all orange Nike basketball shoes, and it's like that. I can't see myself wearing those. And in the book Joyful, Ingrid's like, why?
Wow.
So she started to lean in, like, at what point did baby blue stop being, or your favorite color stop being your favorite color? And her argument is, the older we get, the more neutral and the more earth tone our wear, the way we paint our house. Like, we may have a favorite color, but something happens the older that we get where we don't give ourselves permission. It doesn't feel mature to have that periwinkle chair or the baby blue front door or to rock out the orange Nike basketball shoes. We start thinking, what will people think, instead of framing it in terms of what will really bring me
That's
joy.
interesting.
And so when you start thinking about that, I think the same thing happens with joy in general. I think I have not met a person who's like, less joy, please. Like, we all want more joy. But it's almost like the older we get, the more non-essential, frivolous, or childish joy becomes. And we start to believe this narrative that we got to be more down to earth, more realistic. Play and art in kindergarten becomes measurements and assessments. Adventure in life, and when you're a kid, is replaced with accomplishment and productivity. And so systematically, joy is kind of like squeezed out of the places where we spend our time. And so joy is good. We should want it, but we should also keep it together. It's like, don't delight too much. Don't dance too much. Don't go overboard. Life is serious business. So this starts to get personal for me, because like, when you're a kid, I want my kids to delight. And the older they get, I start to tell them to settle down. So this is the tension, right? We want it, and we resist it. I just never thought about that before. It's like we have this internal battle where we're afraid. I was talking to some friends on staff. It's like, if you have a really good week, you're afraid to tell people how delightful the week was, because
Right.
they may have had a bad week. And so you can't even share it. And the older we get, it's like the less permission we have. And yet, we're talking about it as a fruit of the Spirit. Like, this is what God wants to produce in our life. So, think through that. Did you ever have a moment where, it was like, you felt like somebody said, stop being so joyful, or joyful isn't what we do now that you're at this age or stage?
It's funny. I didn't think that, but when you were just talking, I immediately went to like this last year in 2020.
Yeah.
And I thought, like, there were some really great parts of it. And like, I almost felt like I couldn't talk about that out loud. Like, hey, we're having a great time at home. Like, our families.
Yeah, it's really hard, everybody.
Our families enjoying, like, we've gotten creative, like we're loving, like, and I almost felt like I needed to feel bad about that, because and sometimes I did, and I was at least feeling measured. Like, there were times, and it wasn't all great, but obviously, but I think that's what I thought of. Like, it was hard to share joy in the midst of so much chaos and difficulty and unrest in our world. So yeah, I think I felt like I couldn't express that.
So this is interesting. It's fresh for me too. It's almost like joy is unfair. And if we feel like it all has to be fair in order for it to be good or for us to care, then you can't have joy. Another word that you used is you felt measured. I don't think joy is measuring things. Yeah. And so that's what happens. It's like, those orange shoes for my son would give him joy, but he gets measured, and he's like, it's probably a little too much.
Yeah. Well, it's what Steve said earlier when he said freedom. The word that came to my mind was sort of uninhibited.
Yeah.
Like, joy is uninhibited. It doesn't have restriction.
Yeah.
And when we have restriction, it kills the joy.
It's so true, because when you were talking about the muted tones and how we've just muted that joyful sound, we don't know what to do with it. And so even it's like a muscle that we've not actually known how to exercise, because when something good happens, we're like, should I be experiencing this good? Or like, how do I even say it well? Or how do I not make somebody else feel bad? But when a kid gets something on Christmas,
Yeah.
and they're like, oh my goodness, like
Nobody's going, shh, quiet down, quiet down.
But
It's Christmas, we're being reverent.
yeah, and
But when was the last time you saw an adult do that?
Right.
Right. It becomes a silly TikTok or something, and everybody's making fun of it because you said like, it's almost like you become too mature for joy. And losing your mind on Christmas is now you're being immature.
Yeah.
I always think about, I love music. I love going to concerts and shows, and we would jam, we'd be standing at the front. And now it feels like I'm too old for that.
Yeah.
I can't act silly like that. I would be like the old lady there, and I'm still gonna wear my Justin Timberlake shirt and like scream and cry, but like it's gonna be pure joy, but it's going to look so ridiculous because I'm 42 years old, what are you doing?
It's funny, my wife just did something, when you were talking about that, my wife did something for me recently when I was out of town. I came home and she had done something for me that I just thought, and it really brought me joy, but I didn't express it. And she was like, she felt like it didn't matter to me. But I felt like, as I think back on that, I felt weird about expressing joy. Because I'm going to tell you what it is. She got my bike, like I ride my bike all the time, and she got it tuned up. And like, I was really happy about it. It's something I've been wanting to do and needed to do. And like, and so anyway, she got it tuned up and the gear's tuned up and it's riding a lot better. And it literally brought me joy, but I just felt like as a 46-year-old guy, it's weird for me to get excited about my bike being tuned up. Like, is that weird? Like, it shouldn't be weird because I really I don't know. Maybe that's not what we're looking for. We'll edit that part out.
Yeah.
No, I actually think you're putting your finger on the journey that I feel like I've been on. And it's on the one hand, it's like I feel like I'm a joyful person. I love to laugh. I love to eat good food. I love to have fun with friends. But stepping into this, it's like, this is what my world needs now. And so I started thinking about, like the fruit of the Spirit. What if we are unintentionally resisting the kind of fruit that God's trying to produce in my life? And part of it is, it's because it needs to be all internal. It needs to probably be more serious than it is. And so I think one of the keys with all of the fruit of the Spirit is understanding the difference between living from something and living for something. And when you live from something, it's understanding what you already have. I'm not in search of it. Living for something is trying to find what you feel like is missing. And so one is a place of security, or you could call it an abundance mindset or growth mindset, like, hey, I'm secure in a good place and moving towards something. The other is a place of insecurity, and you go reaching for it. If you look at Galatians 5:22, it doesn't say the kind of fruit that you should produce as a Christian or as a Jesus follower is love, joy, peace, as if it's on you to do all of the work. It's really about living from what God's Spirit, the kind of fruit God's Spirit will produce. So another way to think about it is the difference between trusting and trying, trusting in God's Spirit to do something that you can't versus trying to attain joy on your own. So if that's the case, the quest to find joy for me begins with this truth, like what is it that I'm living from? And that sent me down a bit of a rabbit trail. There's hundreds of uses of the word joy in the Bible that oftentimes are connected to the word grace. And so you see elements of joy and grace, joy and goodness, joy and hope, joy and love. But there's no place in the Bible that says, hey, let me make it real clear, this is exactly what joy is. I think the closest that we get is Nehemiah 8:10. And I don't have time to go into all of the context, but he's trying to bring some encouragement to a group of people who've just been through a lot. And they're facing the gravity of their history in this kind of this sacred moment. And he's like, time out, stop being dejected and sad. The joy of the Lord is your strength. It's like that. I remember being introduced to that, and it's like the idea of joy as strength is like, joy seems soft. It seems like frivolous or fragile would be another word. It doesn't feel like, somebody, Dwayne Johnson showing up like The Rock, like, hey, I'm here to help back you up, right? So I think I think part of the reason that we think joy is soft is because culturally we think of joy as a feeling of happiness, which means the absence of joy or the opposite of joy is sadness or suffering or hardship, which is why I think so many people feel like suffering and hardship eliminate joy from their life. That's why it's fragile or it's elusive, because as soon as something bad happens, it feels like joy goes away. If that's the case, then the fruit of the Spirit is it is weak. So the joy that the Bible talks about has to give, if it's really strength, then maybe my definition of joy or what I'm living from is off. And that's when I was introduced to Angela Gorell's book, The Gravity of Joy. She just released it. I don't know if any of you, I know you had heard of it.
Yep.
She was hired by Yale to study joy from a scientific perspective, philosophical perspective, and a religious perspective, and she's a Christian. Within months, a close family member died by suicide, a young cousin, I think, of hers. Not long after that, about a month later, her father dies, who was a lawyer, very successful, died because of an opioid addiction that started out of a hip or knee surgery or something. And then not long after that, her 22-year-old nephew died of a cardiac arrest out of the blue. And so going to study joy, and now all of a sudden she's confronted with the gravity of grief. And the theoretical joy that she was researching at Yale suddenly felt like shallow and distant. And she just goes on this journey to unpack the grief and all of this stuff. And by chance, through her church, she was invited in the midst of her grief to join a women's Bible study. The catch was that it was at a prison, a women's prison. And so she showed up just to serve, right? And what she discovered is that they, in the midst of their suffering, were still experiencing joy. And so she started to lean into that, talking with this woman, many of whom have suffered with suicidal thoughts, addiction, guilt, grief, all of that. Joy didn't obliterate their grief, but their reality had allowed joy to have a mysterious capacity to exist alongside of it. Their joy gave them strength. At the end of her book, her final lecture, I think the way that she summarized it is that she basically said, dare to believe that your life is worth living. You can't hear it enough. We're not telling people enough. And so I think that's what joy is for me. It's this belief that your life, it's living from the place that my life is worth living. So that even in the midst of the grief, even in the midst of the hardship, I think that's the kind of joy that God's Spirit is trying to produce in our life. I mean, that's the message of the gospel. God gave His Son because your life was worth that to Him in some mysterious way. And so when we live from what God has already done, it should produce this, man, my life is worth it. Even in the midst of the hardship, it's worth it. And so I think that's what James ultimately gets to when he says, consider it pure joy when you face troubles. Like, your life is worth it even in the midst of hardship. Because he goes on in verse 3 and 4, you know that when your faith is tested, it produces endurance, and then you grow, and you end up perfect, complete, needing nothing. Like, there's something about that kind of joy in the midst of trial that grows us. So does that resonate with you?
Ben, what do you like thinking about this? Because this is such powerful stuff. I've never thought of it like this before. Like, do you think for so many of us, we live our life not trying to experience pain or suffering? Stay safe, just make sure everything's good. But then, I heard once that, the amount of pain or suffering. So if this is 0 on the linear line, this is 10, this is -10. If we experience -4 of pain and suffering, we have the ability to experience 4 of joy. That they are connected in the sense of, so in prison, people have experienced grief or worked through their grief, they've been able to experience on the other side the same side. I never heard anyone describe it the way you did, but it just reminded me of that, because I've been so afraid at so much of my life to lean into pain, but I think that's muted my joy.
Yeah, that's interesting.
I don't know.
I think some people experience a lot of pain and never experience joy.
Yeah.
So I think it's working through the grief.
Working through the grief.
Or or coming to the realization that even in the midst of all this pain, that there's something. I think the phrase for me is that it's worth it.
It's worth it.
That it's and that's what's hard.
Yeah.
That's when you feel like the joy is gone. People find themselves at a place where they're like, if this is what life is, it's not worth it. And I think on the flip side, we chase these anecdotal things because it's worth the moment of happiness. And where this started to push in for me is, and even when we experience those things, we don't feel worthy of the joy that it brings. So what do? We feel silly about it. Like, it's silly that your bike brought you joy. There's a shame piece under the surface that's like, you're actually not worthy of that joy. The women's Bible study that she went through, joy allowed them to look at their mistakes and their reality and help them go, but it's the fight you're fighting is still worth it.
Oh, that's good.
So that's what opened the door then for them to go, when they would sing songs together, they would sing even if you couldn't carry a tune. I mean, she was like, their boldness of singing in prison was huge, and they did it for the joy of it, not that because this was worth it for them. And they were pushing back against the narrative that life wasn't worth living.
I feel like when you're at that point in your life, like you have really nothing to lose and you have nothing to prove. You're like stripped of all your dignity. You're in prison. And so like Steve was saying, you know, like there's a correlation between suicides and affluence, right? People going after temporary happinesses and trying to achieve joy to where they're so muted. They're trying to live this controlled, happy life and end up not being able to stretch to experience valid joy because they just want to stay in
They're
between
trying to
the
guard
lines.
themselves,
Yeah, and I think that that's just so American of us. To just say, you know, I don't want to experience pain, and you know, joy's a little silly. We're gonna live here, and how much that's not living to the full.
Yeah. So if I rephrase some of what you're chasing down, if your idea of joy is really limiting the amount of suffering or grief that you go through, or processing it, even acknowledging it, then you're really limiting the amount of joy that you can have on the other side.
I actually think that's the differentiating factor, because you know, like with attachment theory, like the whole idea is when you detach from trauma or brokenness in your past, like you're detached from that, or you avoid it, or you don't actually connect with it, acknowledge it, embrace the injury that was created, and then do something about it, experience healing, experiencing. So that's what, when you do that, that actually deepens your ability to feel. It's terrifying. It's difficult. It's especially when there are things that are years ago that you're ashamed about, or that really hurt, and you don't enter into that. It does limit, because for you to feel, for you to open yourself up to greater feeling of joy, it opens the same door to the brokenness, the risk of feeling the brokenness of the past. So you limit feeling in general. You have to, and so that's the people that you meet that go, when you say, hey, how's it going? I'm good.
Yeah.
And they're always good.
Yeah.
But they live with such a small range of emotion. And they resist deep feeling of pain. And so they miss out on the highs or the tremendous peaks of the joy that's possible for them as well.
Because when you said like we experience shame when we experience joy, I want to get curious. Why do I feel that shame? Once I start leaning into that, getting curious about that, it's going to make me feel more, which is going to allow me to receive more. You know, and I think there's something in that.
Something revealed, right? The rejection or the self-consciousness or the insecurity of being broken wide open, so that it's almost too vulnerable. Like, I can't feel that joy because then people might judge me, or I won't.
It's almost like when you
look
said
like
the
I have
worthy
it.
thing. It's like when I realized that, like, this person rejected me or didn't like me or hurt me for things that are really true about me. Like that are like either my mistakes or they're things that are not enjoyable or attractive or whatever about me, and they're actually like, but then I have to embrace that and allow myself to go, okay, that's actually real, and that's whether that's sin or brokenness or somebody's preference. Then when somebody does love me, even though they know all of that stuff,
Yeah.
like now think about how much of the range of I experience the joy of not all, if you're experiencing all this pain, and on top of that, the real joy of the positive
Grace.
side of the grace
Love,
or
acceptance.
the love, acceptance, because I realized this is actually,
Yeah.
some of these things are actually true about me. And
Ah.
it's tough to embrace. But you know what, I want to go back to the idea you said earlier though, on some level, like you said about joy is really this belief in that life's worth living. And even these things are worth something.
That's right.
These brokenness, these hurts, like they have worth in our lives.
So that's where I would say lean in, because we all have moments where we go, this isn't worth it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's where for me, joy goes, why isn't it worth it? Why do you think it's not worth it for you? Why is life no longer worth living if this isn't the case? That's what breaks open
Yeah.
a deeper reality, which is like, oh, I need their approval. I need the title.
Yeah.
I need less pain.
Yeah.
I'm envious that they have, that when you start to dig into that, I'll put it this way, you realize what you're really living for instead of where you're living from.
100%.
Yeah, that gets uncovered. And I feel like joy takes a lot of courage, like because you're
It does.
facing a fear after a fear.
Yeah.
And again, to your point of the stretch, my husband has always talked about like things that I'm scared to go into. And he's like, is that really scary? Or is that stretching? Is that going to are you going to level up after experiencing that? And I
That's
think
good.
joy, choosing joy and allowing the Spirit to fill you with joy and to not resist that, no matter how much of a free fall that feels like.
Right.
That requires courage. You've got to kind of drop your front man. You've got to you got to allow yourself to feel some things that might feel a little goofy.
And what he's saying is it's worth it.
Yeah, well,
And
what if,
you said it's worth it.
But what if it's this? Joy is a life worth living, and joy is a life worth feeling. In the sense of allowing ourselves to feel all of it,
Yep.
because I'm like, it's like, that's the life that's worth living. That's the people, like, when I get around you, Ben, you're like, you can go to places, and I've seen you experience that range, you're like, I want more of that. And that's that courage that you're talking about. But like, that's the life I want to live.
Yeah.
It's not closed off, but one that can celebrate when, something joyful happens. And I just keep thinking about that. The messages we have, whether we're 13 years old and we wore our bright orange shoes and someone said something, and all of a sudden we were like, out of self-preservation, don't ever do that again. Right. And but it's
Somebody
like,
said something.
instead of feeling that, to kind of go, who cares?
Who cares?
The courage.
This
That's
makes
right.
me happy.
This makes me happy. That's right.
So let's just have a fun thought experiment here. Go to your favorite workspace, okay?
Okay.
If you need to visualize it, look around the room, and there's probably something in the room that gives you great joy. Like just the sight of it brings a smile to your face. I want to know what that thing is.
My office, I have a surfboard. And
Okay.
so it just reminds me of my roots of California. And every time I see it, I just can feel the smell of the Pacific and the feel the sand in my shoes.
Yeah.
So,
That's great.
Yeah.
I've never surfed, so it sounds like a joyful time.
it is. It
Yeah.
is.
Okay, so mine, I feel like I should be saying like the pictures of my children on the wall. This is gonna sound so goofy, and it's gonna go back to the buffet thing, guys. In my office, my thing that brings me joy, I'm not even joking, like I need to be ready for whatever snacks may come. I have a salt shaker, and I have 100 packs of miniature soy sauces. I like salt a lot, and I like my food to taste really good. And when I open that up, it just is a part of who I am. No one gets me. I don't publicize, obviously now everybody knows America, but it brings me so much joy to know that like this is going to make my meal so good, and I'm prepared.
Love that.
It's so weird.
That's so good.
Do you have something?
Mine's a wall. It's funny. When you first walk into our house, we have this big open room, and it's kind of like a weird room because it's like our dining room's in there now, and then there's chairs in there. But when we first moved in, we didn't have furniture for that room, so it was just a big open room. And there's this one wall that we literally used to like. We'd use it as like a kickboard. We kicked soccer balls off it, and like we'd play games in there all the time. And so when nobody's home, I like to go sit in that room and work. And now hanging on that wall is the word home.
Yeah.
And it like that wall like epitomizes like fun and joy. And my kids are like, now all the dining room stuff's in front of it. And my kids like, why do we have all that stuff? We never even sit there. We don't eat there. It's like, can we get rid of that so we can play on the wall again? And yeah,
That's
so
great. I think what's interesting is there are sentimental things that bring us joy, memories that bring us joy. But you did something I'm so glad you shared.
I'm like, mine's the lamest now.
It's awesome.
I'm like,
yours
I
is
should have got a
awesome.
little deeper.
No, are you listening? It's lame.
Yeah. Oh.
It's goofy.
Oh no.
There it is.
I'm having a moment.
We all do that.
Yeah.
When somebody finds something that we think is frivolous,
Good, Ben.
we lay all of the things on the table why it's ridiculous, because we feel, to a small degree, ashamed or something like this shouldn't really
Not normal.
But it
bring me
does.
joy, but it does.
Right.
And so I think that's for me in February, Annie F. Downs writes about this, by the way. She just talks about stop shaming your fun. She says, pay attention to the words that you say. She says, if you ever say, I can't wait to, that means you're living from a good place, looking forward to an adventure. If you start to say, if I could only, that means you're looking for something that you don't have today. And I think that, paying attention, like I'm paying attention to how I talk about the things that give me joy. And if I start giving you all the reasons why I think it's dumb, then I'm stopping myself going, hey, you know what? I don't actually need you to think that this is, what you think about my packets of soy sauce over here are irrelevant because it's a gift
Right.
that brings me joy. And you should have the freedom to enjoy that. In February, this past year, February's tough in Northwest Ohio. Lots of cold, gray, dark, dreary days. Early in the night, you're inside. And after a season of COVID and having some team tensions that transitioned into a bit of, I wouldn't say normal, probably marriage and family stuff. I just found myself battling a cloud in my soul. And out of that, some very random dark thoughts that basically were like, it's not worth it, man. You're a failure, you're unsatisfied, you're discouraged, you're exhausted. I don't know that it's going to be any better. Somebody could probably be better at all of these roles. And I know now, if I were to ask you, you'd be like, you're ridiculous. But in the moment, I started to go, man, is life really, where am I living from? And what am I looking for? And, I would say the voice of shame was loud. You can't, you won't. And it was in the midst of that, through friends. Joel, I know I talked to you a little bit, but I was just reminded of one of my life verses, Hebrews 12, 1 and 2. Talks about how life's a race, that there's actually a crowd of witnesses cheering us on, like your life is worth living. And so we need to run. We need to get rid of all the unnecessary things that are slowing us down. Like, what are the things I'm holding on to? What are the shame voices? Where am I caveating the things that that give me joy? Especially the sin, the unhealthy thoughts or behaviors that you've allowed. Get rid of all of that so that you can run the race that God has put before you, so that you can live life as though it's worth living. In verse 2, and I hadn't really thought about this until I thought about joy. It says, we do this by keeping our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him. Like, this is one of the weirdest places that joy is used. Joy was set before him. Because the joy set before him, he endured the cross. Like, a Roman torture device and joy don't belong in the same sentence. But there's a mysterious connection between allowing himself to experience an enormous amount of pain because he saw what was worth it. And what he did is because of the joy set before him, he endured the cross. And do you know what he did? What's it say next? He scorned its shame. And so that's what started to connect all these things to me, that The fruit of the Spirit that God wants to produce. What my world needed in February was a reminder that Jesus gave his life because life is worth living. He has a race for me. And yes, there may be crosses involved, but there's a joy set before me. And with the Spirit of God, we can scorn the voice of shame in our life that says it's not worth it. I can scorn the voice of shame when it says, those orange shoes people are going to think is really over the top. And instead, know that my life is worth living. I'm going to live from that place, which then opens the door for you and me to freely enjoy the simple pleasures of life. Enjoy is the act of joy. It's the verb of joy. It's joy in action. And so my hope is that we all experience a little bit of that. Stop shaming your fun, and instead we can taste and see how good God is and how much your life is worth living.
So good.
Love it.
The God who was, we worship the God who is, we worship the God who evermore will be. He opened the prison doors, he parted the raging sea. My God, he holds the victory. Yeah. There's joy in the house of the Lord, there's joy in the house of the Lord today, and we won't be quiet. Shout out your praise. There's joy in the house of the Lord. Our God is surely in this place, and we won't be quiet. We shout out your praise. Shout it. Yeah. We sing to the God who heals. We sing to the God who saves. We sing to the God who always makes a way. 'Cause he hung up on that cross, then he rose up from the grave. My God, still rolling stones away. There's joy in the house of the Lord. There's joy in the house of the Lord today, and we won't be quiet. We shout out your praise. There's joy in the house of the Lord. Our God is surely in this place, and we won't be quiet. We shout out your praise. 'Cause we were the beggars, now we're royalty. We were the prisoners, and now we're